Good morning, everyone. Today we will be discussing the topic of coercive diplomacy in peace resolution and conflict management. So, to begin with, we're going to be discussing the nature of coercive diplomacy. Eventually, we'll move on into the difficulties and then finally the cases. We'll summarize everything at the end, so don't worry. So, what is the nature of coercive diplomacy? What is coercive diplomacy? By definition, it is to persuade, not to bludgeon, states, non-state actors, or organizations. So what is the meaning of to bludgeon? Well, to hold a stick and hit someone with it, to get what you want. The best quote you can get for this is from President Teddy Roosevelt, who said that you need to speak softly and carry a big stick. Now, for most of you who have been with Mr. Makar's classes in the past, you've seen him display an example of this. But I won't, I'm not as good as him. So what is it? To use some force in comparison to diplomacy, to show your target your readiness to engage in war if the terms were not applied. So it's basically a moderation of both diplomacy and hostile actions. The general lessons of coercive diplomacy. So what are the steps you need to apply in order for you to succeed in an effective coercive diplomacy method? So first of all, you need to be clear in what you want from the target. The target needs to be aware of what your goal is in your actions. Second of all, you need to create a sense of urgency to comply in the target. So this can be done either by posting hostile troops at the borders or sending air forces, whatever action you can come up with. Show the target that non-compliance will lead to consequences. So you need to make it clear to your target that if they don't comply, you will not hold back in using hostile measures. Decide whether to include positive inducements with the threats and be ready for commitment. Now, it has been shown that deciding whether to include positive inducements were pivotal in 2 of the successful cases the US has engaged in. And to be ready for commitment, since the coercive diplomacy might take a long time, it is always safer for the head of state to be ready no matter what and stern and strict regarding his actions. So what are the 3 strategies employed in coercive diplomacy? So the first strategy involves displaying your ultimatum, drawing a red line. So if you threshold this red line, consequences will occur. To set a deadline, so a time limit by which you want this to be resolved, and to show clearly to your target that non-compliance will result in punishment. The second strategy, the try and see strategy, involves kind of the same steps. You start off by giving your ultimatum. You threaten that if they don't compel with your goals, you will resort to hostile measures. And finally, you wait and see what your target does before continuing. So if your target doesn't compel or doesn't comply with your goal, you can resort to forceful actions. Finally, you have turning the screw. Now this one is pretty simple. All you have to do is increase the sanctions the further it takes for the target to comply with your actions or with your goals. Now, the last 2 aren't as effective as the first one. Why is coercive diplomacy difficult to apply successfully? First of all, it's a form of compellence. It's different from deterrence. Now, when you want to deter a target, the target will assume in his head that he has a justification for abiding by your law. If you want to compel him, on the other hand, he won't have as much justification, so he will seem weak on the international stage. It's less effective to threaten with force than deny, punish, or pose with a threat of risk of further punishment. So what are these meanings? What do these things mean? To deny someone, to deny the state, is to reduce their military capabilities. To punish them is literally, as it says, to apply sanctions or use force. And to pose them with the risk of further punishment is to promise punishment. Now, both of those aren't as effective as using strong use of force. And the denying one and the risk of further punishment, because you're promising of punishment, are not as effective as actual physical punishment. It's directed at a target's resolve. So coercive diplomacy can be seen as a contest of wills. But since resolve is not really measurable unless in time of crises, it can be hard to determine whether your target will eventually comply with you. So in this regard, if both the target and the coercer have the same amount of will and resolve, it might lead to war. And let me mention right now that war is an immediate failure of coercive diplomacy. Credibility and power. So, as we've said, since it's a method of compellence rather than a method of deterrence, if a target was to abide by the goal of the coercer, he would be seen as weak, not only in the present, but in the future as well. Because the coercer can at any time, after have gotten his initial goal, ask for a second goal in return. In this case, the target might try to resort to counter-coercive measures. It can also lead to war. But these are the difficulties. There are two more factors. There are two more factors that can cause issues regarding coercive diplomacy. The first one is when you have multiple coercers. So what do we know about multiple coercers? There's obviously going to be a coalition. Where there's a coalition, there might be difficulties communicating, which might increase the difficulty. On the other hand, you have multiple targets. When you have multiple targets, it's obvious to understand, it's logical rather, that you'd have different strategies for each target. Because quite logically, you'd have different goals for each target. Which is why this might prove difficult. Then on, you can have the targets can believe they have means of countering. So before that, I forgot to mention on the whiteboard, but when you're engaging multiple targets, it is possible that one of these or two of these targets might have conflicts in between them. So one of them might see it beneficial for themselves to allow you to continue your hostilities towards one of the targets. And in that action, they might believe they have a way of countering your coercion methods. So in this case, if they do indeed have counter-coercive measures, they won't announce it to the public because the coercer himself will be aware of it and therefore might lead to the failure of coercive diplomacy. Now, one thing you need to know is that in the case where coercive diplomacy doesn't work for the coercer, he is up with two choices. He or the state, they are up with two choices. Either they back down or they up the ante. If they back down, they lose reputation and credibility. If they up the ante, they increase the risk of there being war, immediately failing coercive diplomacy. So now we'll be discussing the cases. Now the cases are mostly in between 1990 and 2006. The book provides you with many, but I'm going to stick to the few I've noted here. So the first one is Somalia. Now, prior to 1992, there was a government. Negotiations with said government failed. The hope was to institute a democracy instead of the dictatorship that was already present. Now, when the government failed, warlords rose to power. And within the rise of these warlords, we had the increase of famine. Now, it was estimated that this famine would hit over 2 million people. So in attempts to aid these people, the United States and the United Nations attempted to go in. To do so, they wanted to provide aid, prevent the famine from ever happening. Now, in this case, this is where the first successful coercive diplomacy I'm going to mention happened. The United States sent troops to Somalia, a massive amount of troops, with the threat to the warlords that if they were to intervene in the actions of providing the aid, countermeasures would occur and hostilities would start. So now the warlords didn't take this threat lightly and didn't get involved, and this was the first success in coercive diplomacy in Somalia. However, after they presented the aid and the United States withdrew their troops, they were presented with a new action. They wanted a new goal, a second goal, to remove the warlords from power. To remove the warlords from power. To do so, the United States sent half-hearted troops, and the United Nations also sent troops. Now, the warlords didn't get involved at first and didn't engage in hostilities due to the fact that their power wasn't threatened. Their regime was not threatened. The United States would not attack them and would not remove them from power. Africa. So, in the second attempt, however, in their second goal, where they were desiring to remove the power of the regime did not stand still and hostilities began. The United States lost some casualties, had some casualties, and so they withdrew their troops. This was a failure in coercive diplomacy, because not only did it lead to casualties, it wasn't successful in achieving their goal. This was Somalia. Now we're going to move on to the next one, which is Haiti. Haiti in 1994. Now, in 1990, Haiti held their first free democratic elections, to which came to succession a priest by the name of Jean-Bertrand Aristide. He ascended to power. In 1991 of February, he came into office. However, 7 months later, the military took over. They initiated a coup, removing him from power. The United States, witnessing this, couldn't stand still. So they started negotiations with the first head of power, the first head of the military, who in turn refused to negotiate and refused to step down. There were negotiations happening with the second head of power. However, this increased in tension when the United States sent the former President Jimmy Carter, the Senator Sam Nunn, and former Joint Chief of Staff Colin Powell, and 25,000 troops, 25,000 troops into Haiti. Now, why did they do that? To impose hostility, to impose pressure on the current military regime who were holding power. Now, at first, it was seen as borderline success. Why? Because they did succeed in bringing back the president into power. The military did step down, but it could have went to war. Why? Because the second in head wasn't aware of the troops coming in. He saw it as a hostile act. It eventually settled down and was seen as borderline success for coercive diplomacy. Now we move on to the next case, which had 3 attempts at coercive diplomacy. Iraq. In between 1990 and 1998, we all know that Saddam Hussein tried invading Kuwait and borderline going into Saudi Arabia. What was the response of the United States? We had Operation Desert Shield in 1990. A failure, but here's why. So we've previously said how going into war is seen as a failure of coercive diplomacy, because the goal of coercive diplomacy is not to go to war, but to win in what you desire without war. Of course, you'll have to show off your big stick, but still. So, Operation Desert Shield. Troops were sent into the Persian Gulf to dissuade Saddam Hussein into going further into Kuwait and backing off. Saddam Hussein didn't back down, and so war occurred. Ergo, why it's a failure. Second, we have Operation Provide Comfort in 1991 up until 1996. It was an attempt to protect the Kurdish settlements inside Iraq from getting massacred by Saddam Hussein and preventing them from going into Turkey and Iran. Now, this was seen as a success until 1996 because no large-scale attacks were held by the Iraqi troops. So it was pretty successful at coercive diplomacy. The final one in this case, well, in this era at least, because we're going to talk about Iraq later again, is Operation Vigilant Warrior in 1994. Now, in 1994, Saddam Hussein had sent troops back onto the borders of Kuwait in an attempt to re-invade it. Now, the United States, seeing this, wanted to prevent hostilities again and send troops. Now, this troops was sent as a means of hostility, of coercive diplomacy. So we have troops there. You engage with us, we negotiate with you. If we negotiate with you and you then decide to attack us, our troops will hit you back. So this was the treaty. The first one was a failure, and the second 2 were successes. Next slide, please. Okay, in 1998 and 2001, the strikes against terrorism. So coercive diplomacy were held against terrorists. Now, we all know that in 2001, the United States was hit at the Twin Towers by 2 planes. It was a failure. It was a failure. Why? Because in 1998, the United States had engaged in retaliatory actions in 2 places, in Khartoum and in Afghanistan, in the training camp for Afghanistan, for Al-Qaeda. Now, why were these retaliatory actions held? Because terroristic organizations such as Al-Qaeda had hit 2 embassies of the United States in Tanzania and Kenya. So the United States couldn't stand still. It had to reply. In its reply, in these 2 bombings, air bombings, the United States was sending a message. If you mess with us, the consequences will be great. So don't mess with us. However, we see now that failed. That was a failure at coercive diplomacy because in 2001, there were 2 attacks at the Twin Towers. Further on, we went on to the next coercive attempt, which was at the Taliban. So, bin Laden was not given up by the Taliban. War pursued. Why? The United States had attempted to send heavy bombers onto the borders of Afghanistan where the Taliban headquarters were. They had threatened the Taliban that if they had not given up Osama bin Laden to be trialed for his actions and his crimes, the United States would retaliate. We all saw how that went. War waged on. We're still fighting against terrorism until today. Coercive diplomacy was a failure. Why? War is an imminent factor in the failure of coercive diplomacy. Okay. Fighting terrorism with coercive diplomacy is hard due to their wish retaliation or overreaction by the coercer. So a terroristic organization's wish is to be overreacted by the state, the coercer they're wishing to fight against. The state, in this case, United States. The moment the state replies with hostile actions, the terrorists have what they wish. So this is why it's difficult to fight against terrorism with coercive diplomacy. Next slide, please. Now we're back in Iraq. In between 2002 and 2003, the US under the Bush administration had two goals. The first goal was to deprive Saddam Hussein of any weapons of mass destruction. The second goal was to remove Saddam Hussein's regime. In their first goal, they were backed up by the UN because the UN resolution under 1441 had to send IAEA, research groups, if you will, to look for presence of chemical weapons or weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Now, Saddam Hussein was very clear in that he didn't want the IAEA to be present in his country. He even held hostages, researchers, for 4 days, which backed up the retaliation of both Russia and France, including the US eventually, of course. So Saddam Hussein, seeing a threat to his regime, eventually agreed to the researchers to happen. He allowed the IAEA, as well as another UN commission, to search everything, even his Republican Guard. He opposed a decree which told every faculty in Iraq to allow research by the IAEA and the UN. Now, eventually, no weapons of mass destruction were found, no traces of chemical weapons were found, and that was a success. That first attempt at coercive diplomacy was a success. Why? Because the United States and the UN were able to force Saddam Hussein into allowing the presence of researchers. The second attempt, however, was a failure. The United States wanted to remove Saddam Hussein from the regime. They didn't get the approval of the UN or the Security Council, but they didn't eventually get in, under the pretense that there was chemical weapons there. War happened, instant failure for coercive diplomacy. Now, before we move on to the next slide, I would like to include talks about Libya. Actually, it is on the next slide. Let's go. Thank you. Libya in 2003. Now, there were two administrations involved with this coercive diplomacy. The first one was the Clinton administration, in which they had two goals: to make Gaddafi take credibility for the Panama Tree issue and to stop aiding terrorists. Now, although this had happened in 1999, in the early 1999, Gaddafi had attempted to get in communication with the US so he could give up his weapons of mass destruction. So in this case, we see an instant success. Why? Because they're willing to negotiate. They're willing to be compelled to comply. So by the early 2003, the coercive diplomacy attempts were regarded as success and UN sanctions were lifted. So Gaddafi agreed not only to take credibility for the Panama issue, to assume responsibility, but to also aid the families that fell victim to it. They stopped aid to terrorists. The United States under the administration of Bush, however, had different wishes. They wanted Saddam Hussein, Omar Gaddafi, to give up his weapons of mass destruction, which was already settled. They removed the UN sanctions after he agreed to the first two goals, and he did them, but they didn't remove the US sanctions until he gave up his weapons of mass destruction. So the Bush administration dictated that for US sanctions to be lifted, WMDs must be surrendered. Gaddafi surrenders WMD, and their second attempt at coercive diplomacy was also seen as successful. We focus on the will of Gaddafi to cooperate with the US by fear of a reenactment of what happened in Iraq and his will to stay in power. Even a discussion between him and a Venezuelan ambassador was recorded, as he states that he's afraid of failing to comply due to the fear of losing his power. Next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about the new issues since 2006 until date. Now, North Korea isn't really new issues. There were coercive diplomacy attempts directed at them. They were seen as a failure because North Korea didn't really give up their weapons of nuclear capabilities. In Iran, they're still in search of nuclear capabilities. The killing of Soleimani was an example of coercive attempt. Why? They showed the world that they were able to attack ahead of their government from anywhere around. In the case of North Korea, they're still in search of nuclear power until today, even after they met with Trump during his administration. Now, why is nuclear capabilities such a topic that states, targets, will not allow for themselves to give up to the coercion? Well, mainly because they see it as an add-on to their security. They see it as an add-on to their security. Why is it an add-on to their security? Well, it's part of their national interest, so it will be harder for them to give it up. So I'm going to conclude this in a brief matter. Coercive diplomacy. Speak with a soft voice and carry a big stick. The consequences of both of these, of all of these cases were shown. Some of them were successes. There's a 10% to 50% ratio of it succeeding. So I hope you guys understood everything from this. My name is Hassan Youssef Gandour. Thank you for watching.